Hello, and welcome to Human Ascension with Ellie. The book of Genesis in the Bible begins with a translation of the Hebrew language description of how God created the world and the cosmos. It also describes the creation of the planets and the animals that inhabit the earth, and of course, the creation of humanity. Genesis 1:27 states, and I quote, "So God created man in his own image, in the image of God. He created him, male and female. He created them." End quote. When you ask a theologian what it means to say that God created man in his image, that theologian is most likely to explain with something along the lines of it meaning that humans are a reflection of God's character and his attributes. Alternatively, the theologian may provide a slightly different interpretation, which goes something like, God created man with the ability to reason and make choices. And there's a third scenario also where the theologian may say that the phrase that God created man in his own image means that God created humanity to have the capacity for love and relationships, because God has the capacity for love and relationships. The only problem is, and it's kind of a bit of a big problem, somewhat huge, actually. And if I'm going to be honest, really, really huge. So, anyway, the problem is that none of these theological translations of the original Hebrew version of the Bible actually match the meaning of the original language that was used in the Bible. The word image is correct. Image is the correct translation of the Hebrew word tselem, which is the actual word that was used in the original Bible text. But tselem can't be translated into words or phrases like capacity to have relationships in love, or character and attributes, or reason and choices, because the word tselem literally means image. It means picture, like the kind of picture you'd find in a picture frame, or the view of a perfect sunset, or the visualization of what you think you look like in that new pair of jeans, or the way you actually look in those new pair of jeans. Speaking from experience. And here's the proof. I did a search to find out what the process was for translating the ancient Hebrew scripture into English. Obviously, ancient Hebrew has evolved over the centuries into modern Hebrew, so I made sure I also took that into account. This is what I found, and it's kind of interesting. Firstly, let's look at the manner in which the Hebrew word tselem was translated into the English word image. And then let's see how the English word image was interpreted to mean relationships, love, reason, choices, character, and attributes in that sentence of man being created in the image of God. So the first one is easy. The ancient word tselem literally means image in English. So job done, translated perfectly. But then it gets a bit tricky because the word image obviously has definitions that can be looked up quite easily, which, if you know me at all, you'll know that's exactly what I did. I did a search for all possible definitions for the word, the English word image. And this is what I found. Okay, so in the English dictionaries, definition number 1. An image is a visual representation of something, such as a likeness of an object. Definition 2. An image is an optical counterpart of an object produced by an optical device, such as a camera or a mirror. Definition 3. An image is a mental picture or visual impression of something that occurs in the mind's eye. Definition 4. An image is an idea arising from a mental picture of what something looks like. Definition 5. An image is a tangible, visible presentation like the physical photograph that you can place inside a picture frame and hang on your wall. Definition 6. A reproduction or imitation of the physical form of a person or thing can also be an image. So that's 6 definitions so far, and every one of them speaks of an image as being something visual. There are 3 definitions left. Let's look at them a bit more closely. So, definition 7. Okay, an image refers to the reputation that a person, a product, or an organization is known for. Oh, okay, so that sounds promising. Perhaps that's what God was talking about when he said he created man in his image. He wanted man to have his reputation, right? No, wrong. And the reason why it's wrong is because the definition of an image being related to someone's reputation only became part of the English language in 1908, long after the Bible was written, and it started to get used in commercial settings like advertising or marketing. It literally was a new definition created to account for the intangible quality that a person or a product has that can be branded, evaluated by reviews, and marketed to consumers. So that's definition 7 out. Let's take a look at definition 8. An image is a figure of speech which is designed to create a mental picture or sensory experience. All right, the concept of something being a figure of speech means that it's kind of reminiscent of something else. This allows for God to have created man as a being that would remind us of God. Okay, except this definition can't be used either because the concept of anything being a figure of speech wasn't known at the time. In fact, the first known example of there being something similar to a figure of speech is documented to have occurred in the 14th century, long after the Bible was translated into English. Prior to that, the idea of something being figurative is undocumented. So this definition can't have influenced the translation of the word image in the Bible either. So that's 8 definitions that can't possibly prove the sentence right. Okay, so the last definition, definition 9. An image is a set of values given by a mathematical function, such as a homomorphism, whatever that is, that corresponds to a particular subset of the domain. Good grief. Now we're into mathematics, and it's not my area of strength. Okay, I think I've said this before, but let's give it a go. So I had a look up of the word for this, homomorphism. And what it means, apparently, is something that has a particular physical shape. It relates to appearance. And the mathematical aspect of this definition relates to being able to measure shapes and providing labels to measurements so that they can be duplicated onto other parts of a formula. Oh, gosh. And also, this entire definition only appears for the first time in the English language in the 16th century as a method of referring to mathematical equations that required a visualization of something measurable. So that's it. We've just expired all of the 9 definitions for the word image. There are no other definitions in the English language, and that includes American language American English for the word image. But there's more. Remember I said that the original word in the Bible was the Hebrew word selem. Well, the word selem is still a word that's used today in modern Hebrew. And guess what it means? If you don't want to guess, well, you know what? I looked it up because of course I did. And let me share what I found. The modern translation for the word selem is photograph, a physical picture of something. That's it. And there's also another word that locks the definition in. Selem is also part of another word in Hebrew, and that is the word matzelema. Sorry about my pronunciation. Sorry if I butchered it, but I'm good at that. It's matzelema. But the meaning of the word matzelema is literally camera. Selem means picture, and matzelema means camera. That's it. So how did the English word image get interpreted to mean the things that theologians say it means in the Bible? Well, I actually know how because I checked that as well. Embrace yourself because it's a little bit bonkers. So the original Bible text was written in Hebrew, but the translation into the English word image wasn't taken from the Hebrew word. Instead, it was taken from a word that never appeared in the Bible. So it's actually a word that isn't even Hebrew in origin. The interpretation of the word image was taken from the Latin word imitare, which literally means to copy or imitate. The word derives from the earliest olden Latin roots from around 75 BC. At this time, the word or the term imaginem meant to copy or a likeness, a statue, a picture, and an imitation. But sometime later, during the medieval Latin period of around the 12th century, Imaginem started to take on new interpretations, including phantom, ghost, apparition, and the figurative idea of something. So when you put all of this information together, you get a clear understanding of how the phrase God created man in his own image was translated into all of the meanings that theologians use today to describe man as having been created for the purpose of reason and love and relationships and character and things like that. The translators just didn't like the original Hebrew word, so they went elsewhere and they used the Latin word. A bit like when I was a kid and my mother told me that I wasn't allowed to eat ice cream before dinner. So I'd just forget about what she said, and I'd go straight to my dad and I'd ask him because hopefully he'd give me a different answer. The phrase God created man in his own image literally means that God created man to look like God. And that's it. That's all it means. And that brings up a whole bunch of questions about the rest of the Bible's translations. But you know what? We don't have to retranslate the entire Bible today in order to see that something isn't quite right about the messages within it that are somehow being taken for granted by billions of people around the world. Today, I want to show you how this single mistranslation gives new meaning to many things that are written inside the Bible, and one thing in particular. And I decided that there is one set of messages that will tell us a lot about what the Bible might really be all about. And that is the messaging when it comes to the concept of slavery. The word image has a lot to do with that concept of slavery in the Bible. So the Bible contains many references to slavery, which was understood to be a common practice occurring at the time that the books of the Bible were being compiled. The way that theologians explain the concept of slavery in the Bible is that God was trying to teach a barbaric human race. And so he had to do it slowly in a way that barbaric humans would understand and respond well to. So he began, as appears in the Old Testament, to recognize that the patriarchs of the time were from the upper echelons of society. They owned slaves, they enslaved anyone who fell into debt with them, they bought the daughters of fellow citizens, and they kept them often forcefully as concubines. They also enslaved foreign men to work in their fields. So despite God being almighty and able to create man and destroy man and dictate every aspect of man's existence, he had to tread kind of softly when it came to slavery, apparently, just in case he overstepped his orders that must be obeyed, and the people began to lose faith in him as God, apparently. That sounds pretty stupid, to be honest. But it is actually the explanation that people are still learning about in churches all over the world. So taking this into account, the Old Testament is quoted as containing an outline by God on how owners should treat their slaves, what the legal status of slaves should be, the economic role of slaves, the types of slaves that were permitted, the debt payment rules for slaves, and when it was appropriate or not to beat a slave or even kill a slave. And even in the New Testament, there is a concession given by God for men to own slaves. For example, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. I think it's Ephesians 6, phrases 2 to 7. And this is where it states, and I quote, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ, not only when you are under their eye, as if you had to please people, but as slaves of Christ, who wholeheartedly do the will of God. Serve with good will, as to the Lord and not to people," unquote. This is a very telling set of sentences. The second sentence says that slaves should obey their earthly masters, even when they aren't being observed. And you know what that sounds like? What it sounds like it means? It kind of means that whoever first wanted that message to be known couldn't see what the slaves were doing when they weren't being directly observed. So they had to create a rule that would ensure that the slaves were still obeying orders when no one could see them. What this tells me is that whoever created that message or that rule wasn't an all-seeing God because they couldn't see something that wasn't right in front of them. They were earthbound. That's very, very telling. Over time, the interpretation of the Bible's references to slavery changed and adapted to suit culturally accepted practices. For example, during the period of American slavery, Christian slave owners used the writings of the Bible to justify the institution of slavery. However, there are no references in the Bible that specifically state that a slave must be black or from a strict geographic or ethnic origin. So, what was conveniently left out was the fact that if the Bible was condoning slavery, then it was condoning every possible slave type. And that includes a white slave for a black slave owner, or a male slave for a female slave owner. One particular manipulation and revision of text that occurred in the Bible to allow for slavery to be seen as appropriately Christian during the American slavery period appears in Genesis 9:18 through 27. These passages are often referred to as the curse of Ham, and during American slavery became the foundational text to justify the slavery of men and women of African descent. The story that takes place in the passages relates to a time when the great, sort of just after the great flood, it had just taken place when Noah, who was previously described to have walked close to God, so obviously he was a favorite, got drunk and fell asleep naked. He was found by one of his sons called Ham, who briefly observed Noah's nakedness and then reported it to his two brothers. The brothers showed up and covered Noah up to conceal his nakedness. Later, when Noah woke up, he realized that he'd been seen naked by Ham, and he decided that Ham should be cursed for seeing him naked. So he laid a curse against Ham's son, whose name was Canaan, and declared that Canaan would be a servant and that his descendants would forever be servants. Noah also blessed his other two sons for concealing his nakedness. It became convenient at some point in time in American history for these passages to be changed. So they were changed by removing the references to Canaan and adding African descendants to Ham's lineage. So this gave slave owners of the time an entirely fabricated section of the Bible to use to justify the slavery of black people from Africa. Thankfully, today, most Christian denominations condemn slavery and consider it to be a violation of human rights. And what that tells us is that the Bible's passages are easily reinterpreted to suit the ethical and moral standards generally accepted by a contemporary society. And of course, the personal beliefs of the people translating and interpreting the Bible. Okay, so I'm not quite done with the topic of slavery yet, but let's deviate for just a moment and talk about another societal issue that's often debated quite contentiously when it relates to the translation of the Bible. And that is the topic of, or relating to gender identity. Okay, to be very swift about this, because this is not the topic of primary discussion, but just as a comparison. There is a zero reference or even any kind of inference about gender identity in the Bible, not a word. In fact, it could be translated from Genesis 2, 22 to 24, that God created a woman from a man's rib, which indicates that the man had a woman inside him somewhere. That coincides with male and female genders being intertwined. In order to demonstrate otherwise, a person has to make an assumption that a certain meaning to various passages is implied. But generally, when this is tested, the word-for-word literal translations from Aramaic, ancient Greek, or Hebrew show otherwise. And of course, the words and phrases like abomination or shall be put to death are generally lathered all over the Bible, but they just as readily refer to adultery, theft, murder, and even eating unclean food or touching an unclean animal as they do to anything related to gender or sexual identity. It's just that those sins and abominations are far more common in societies that rely on Bible teachings, so it's easier to explain them away. For example, Proverbs 6:16 to 18 lists 6 things which are considered to be abominations, and they are, and I quote, haughty eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked schemes, and feet that are swift in running to mischief, unquote. There are devoted Christians out there right now who are worshipping people who demonstrate all of those 6 abominations, every single one of them in one person. But for some reason, they choose to idolize rather than condemn that person. And so that's a matter of interpretation. Okay, so let's get back to the topic of slavery. There is a growing theory that the Bible is actually a story about something entirely different to what theologians claim, and that it's not exactly a book about the creation of the earth and man and everything else by the almighty single deity called God. The theory is broken up into 2 sub-theories. So let's take a look at these theories, because under these theories, the topic of slavery takes on a whole different meaning. Now, what I'm talking about is the theory that humans evolved from alien DNA. What a surprise! This theory is broken up into 2 major sub-theories, the first of which is panspermia. Panspermia is the idea that life exists throughout the universe and that it's distributed all around with via space dust or meteoroids or asteroids, comets and spacecraft, all of which are contaminated by microorganisms that get transplanted into new places and new planets at any given moment. The idea of panspermia is that humans evolved through the contamination of Earth of alien DNA that either accidentally or deliberately was transferred to Earth from other planets. The other sub-theory is one of genetic engineering, whether it relates to the arrival of ancient astronauts from another world or non-human intelligent beings that resided naturally on Earth and were commingled with other species to produce what we now think of as the human race. The idea of genetic engineering is based on there having been a sentient being that was present on Earth during ancient times, that engineered a hybrid race that ultimately resulted in humanity as we know it today. Now, it should be noted that most scientists support the theory of evolution rather than that of panspermia. They believe that humans evolved from earlier species of hominoids over millions of years through the process of natural selection. The theory of evolution states that hominoids evolved into 4 major species, commonly known as gorillas, chimpanzees, orangutans, and of course, humans. But there are a few issues with the theory of evolution as stated by scientists. Firstly, science hasn't been able to prove that a direct connection occurred in evolution between each of the stages, not for humans anyway. There is a gap, often referred to as the missing link. There are in fact quite a few missing links rather than just one. And the most striking missing link of them all is not necessarily biological. It might actually be technical or industrial in nature. Humans are believed to have begun learning to harness the environment around 3.5 million years ago. The first tools were made at around about that time. Sharp flakes of stone were used as knives, and large unshaped stones were used as hammers. Around a million years ago, so 2 million years later, our Homo sapien ancestors are known to have used fire for the first time in order to stay warm and then eventually for cooking. And so over the course of 2.5 million years, that's about all we humans, or at least our ancestor Homo sapiens, were able to figure out. That's it, over 2.5 million years. But then suddenly, almost as though out of nowhere, there's evidence that as recently as 20,000 years ago, during the Neolithic period, lots of new advances in technology seemed to just suddenly appear. We suddenly went from foraging for food to farming agriculture. We began using clay to create pottery and bricks so that we could build our own homes rather than live inside caves. Clothing began to get made of woven fabrics. And humans also invented the wheel at this time, which led to the rapid acceleration of even more technological advances. What followed was the creation of irrigation systems and sailboats, and then huge ships and the production of metals such as iron and bronze, which were made into all kinds of wondrous new tools and handicrafts. And then alchemy was discovered, which later led to weaponry and medicine. And wind power was discovered as a means for powering mills. Humans seem to suddenly accelerate their grasp of how to utilize the earthly environment for our own purposes. Our progress is proven by the rock carvings that show illustrations of what has been known at certain times in the lifespan of humanity. The rock carvings themselves have been radiocarbon dated, which is a method of precise calculation of the age of an object by testing the radioactive carbon decay of any organic matter that exists around or in the carvings. So our understanding of what humans and their Homo sapien ancestors could and couldn't do at any specific time in our development is pretty accurate. And what our ancestors saw or encountered was generally captured in carvings as well. So it's quite uncanny that from around 20,000 years ago, when all of these exceptionally accelerated skills were being learnt, when our ancestors were suddenly learning these new technologies at warp speed, the rock carvings that they were producing at that time that chronicled their lives also appear to show strange human-like creatures hailed as being gods to be worshipped. Gods like Ra and Amun and Thoth and countless others, including gods that are referenced in the Bible but have all been lumped together in an interpretation of a single god with a multitude of names, which is kind of weird, isn't it? So is he? Is God just one God with a multitude of names? Or is it possible that there were many gods, all with different unique names that all served different purposes or possessed different powers over humanity, either as individuals or as gods to be worshipped at different ages in time? And how does this relate to the references to slavery in the Bible? So, one of the most controversial and highly debated names for God in the Bible is Yahweh. Yahweh appears in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament as an angry, jealous, punishing God who eagerly condoned slavery, took harsh revenge on anyone who didn't explicitly obey his every whim and desire, and played people against each other, elevating the hostilities among men, testing their faithfulness with obscure and illogical tests of loyalty. This Yahweh version of God also features in the panspermia theory that rivals the theory of human evolution. The idea within the panspermia theory is that Yahweh was in fact an example of the ancient astronaut, or the group of ancient astronauts that traveled to Earth from other worlds. Yahweh was an extraterrestrial being who wanted humans to worship him as a god. This understanding of Yahweh allows the reader to consider the literal translation of Bible text that describes Yahweh in ways that could be interpreted as referring to an advanced extraterrestrial being. After all, just as Judge Judy says, Judge Judy, we gotta love Judge Judy, the simplest explanation of what happened is generally the truth. So let's expand on this idea a little bit more. There is an alternative religious movement founded by a man called Claude Vorilhon, commonly known as Rael, who claims that he was visited by an extraterrestrial being called Yahweh, exactly the same as the Yahweh in the Bible. According to Rael, Yahweh revealed to him that humanity was the result of a genetic experiment by an advanced race of aliens called the Elohim. Now, this takes us down a very interesting route because, you see, the Bible refers to Elohim all the way from the start of the book of Genesis and throughout the Old Testament. And the Hebrew literal translation for the word Elohim is, and I quote, the family of gods. So what this immediately does is it confirms in no uncertain terms that the Bible does not refer to a single almighty God. And that's why there are so many different names for God or the gods in the Bible. The word Elohim is a plural word. It is never used and has never been used as a word to refer to a single anything. It's like saying the English word us, which always refers to more than one person. You don't refer to yourself as us in the singular, do you? So when you hear a person say the word us, you know that they're talking about at least two or more people, but maybe, even as many as an infinite number of people, but never just one person. Well, the Hebrew word Elohim is the same. It only ever refers to more than one entity. So for the Bible to refer to Elohim, it is to refer to more than one entity belonging to a family of gods. This sits in perfect alignment with the concept of there being numerous visiting entities on earth who expected, even insisted, on worship by humans. Also, the rock carvings that have been found that date from around 20,000 or less years ago show numerous different types of creatures that appear in many ways to be similar to humans, except they're also a bit different in certain ways. They have creature-like features that are not human, but which allow them, particularly as it relates to their bodies, to retain a human-like appearance. And then, of course, it's important for us to circle back to what I mentioned at the top of this episode about how the book of Genesis begins very early on with descriptions of how God, which we now know could very easily have, or more accurately, been more than one God, created earthly humanity in the image or with the physical appearance of the gods themselves. Suddenly, it seems that the Bible reads a lot easier and is a far more straightforward description of extraterrestrials who were worshipped as gods, who created humanity and placed firm and often harshly enforced expectations upon them. But also they taught those humans to advance themselves technologically by sharing wisdom and skills that would allow them to utilize the earthly environment to which they had been created to inhabit. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, oh, what a load of hogwash. If the Bible wanted me to think that extraterrestrials existed, it would say that extraterrestrials existed, right? Okay, so then this would be the time for me to add a little something that didn't make it into the Bible. Well, actually, I'm lying. It did make it into the Bible, but only in some versions of the Bible. For example, it appears in the Ethiopian Jewish Bible, but the Vatican did not recognize it as being suitable for the Catholic Bible, so it's left it out. And what I'm talking about is the Book of Enoch. Now, the Book of Enoch is an ancient Jewish religious work traditionally ascribed to a fellow called Enoch, who appears as the father of Noah in the Bible, and that's Noah with the great flood. It should be said that most Christian denominations acknowledge the existence of the Book of Enoch as having historical or theological interest, but they don't recognize it as an official word of God. And the reason for that is possibly due to the fact that the Book of Enoch appears to confirm the existence of extraterrestrial beings who cohabitated with earthly beings, and the result of that cohabitation was a hybrid race. Humans are that race. And the weirdest thing is that no matter how bonkers it sounds, it actually provides a seamless explanation of how humans suddenly got so technologically advanced. And it also makes it possible for a literal translation of the Bible to satisfy even the Judge Judy test. The Book of Enoch comprises of 5 books. The first book is the Book of Watchers. It tells a story of a group of angels called the Watchers who descended to earth to live among humans. The angels taught humans various forms of knowledge that was considered to be forbidden. The Watchers also mated with the human women who gave birth to a race of giants that were known as the Nephilim. The Nephilim are understood to be the sons of God that are mentioned in Genesis 6, 1 through 4. These sons of God may also be the heroes from the Age of Heroes that ancient philosophical writings date back to around 1000 BC. Now, the timing may be appropriate. Maybe it was, maybe it was 5,000 BC or 10,000 BC, but I'm estimating around about 1,000 BC. We weren't there, so all we can do is speculate based on the information that we do have available to us through writings and rock carvings and other artifacts. So these heroes, or Nephilim, were great warriors who fought against monsters. Were those monsters alien by any chance? I'm just asking because it does sort of sound like they were. And the number one god, the one who was meant to be in control of everything happening here on Earth, didn't seem to like what he saw. So he punished Earth and washed it clean of all life, except a few chosen people, by introducing a great flood, just like what happened in the Bible. That's what's expressed in the Book of Watchers, in the Book of Enoch. So the other 4 books of Enoch are the Similitudes of Enoch, which talk about the Son of Man, who is a chosen heavenly being who will one day return to judge the wicked and deliver the righteous. The wicked are generally described as people who try to repeat what the Watchers did, and the righteous are generally referred to as people who closely obey the rules set out by God and who recognize only Him as their God. And what this sounds like is a little bit like the concept of the mother who tries to keep her children from misbehaving by saying things like, wait till your father comes home, or the babysitter who says to the children, I'm just popping out to buy some milk, make sure you behave while I'm gone. Which is exactly the kind of things you'd expect a parent or a babysitter to say to children who have a history of misbehaving when they aren't being supervised. So this second book of Enoch does sound as though it's someone saying, the Watchers were bad, don't be like them, otherwise I'm going to come back and get you. That's what it sounds like. The next book in the Book of Enoch is the astronomical book. That's the 3rd book, which talks about how the cosmos works. In particular, the solar calendar is explained and the planetary movements. It's a perfect book for people who are interested in astrology, for example. Then, of course, there's the Book of Dreams, which contains a series of visions and prophecies that Enoch claims came to him in his dreams. And then finally, the 5th book is the Epistle of Enoch, which talks about all of the horrible things that will happen to sinners and the wonderful things that will happen to the righteous. So let's return, with all of this under our belt, to the topic of slavery again, because now it actually starts to make a lot more sense in the Bible. It really does, when you think of it. One thing has always been a bit of a question mark for me when it comes to the Bible is the description of priests in the Bible and how a certain percentage of everything that everyone earned or created for themselves had to be given to the priests. And generally it was quite a large percentage. So if you slaughtered an ox, then you had to give the best part of the ox, a sizable percentage of that ox, to the priest first, and then do with it as you will with the rest of the ox. It makes it seem as though the priest was there to serve a purpose, and this was their payment as representative of the gods on earth. The early priests were being paid by the slavery of those who were not considered to be the messengers of God or the earthly manifestation or messenger of God. And I've always thought there was something not quite right about that. It seems as though those early priests may very well have been a go-between between gods who had harnessed them as being favorable to the gods' purposes to be able to keep the slaves in line. It just seems to fit. Just like the whole Bible seems to fit so much more easily if it's just taken literally, with something like the Book of Enoch also taken into account. And the Ethiopian Bible does that. Makes me want to ask a devout Ethiopian Christian how they feel about the concept of extraterrestrials. So let's summarize what we've talked about today and see if it provides a new explanation of how slavery might be described in the Bible. Let's just say for a moment that the Bible is a story about a bunch of extraterrestrials who all had different names, that are listed in the Bible, one of the most notable being a fellow by the name of Yahweh. The extraterrestrials created a human-like race as an experiment, and they created them in the image of themselves, with 2 legs and 2 arms standing upright with opposable thumbs. They allowed this race of humans to live on the earth, and they monitored them. After a while, they put some angels in charge of monitoring the humans. But the angels, who might also have been different types of extraterrestrials, well, they started to misbehave, and they contaminated the race by mating with them, as some do when they're bored at work or fancy an inter-office romance. This totally ruined the experiment, and so that head extraterrestrial got angry and flushed the entire experiment down the toilet and then started again. This time with a book of instructions, which we call the Hebrew Bible or the Jewish scripture, the Torah. And this time the humans were kept under very strict and watchful eye. They were engaged like slaves. Over the course of time, the extraterrestrials and humans divided away. Yahweh, who had been quite bossy here on Earth, might have finally passed on and been replaced with another extraterrestrial that we know of as Jesus, perhaps. Or maybe the Almighty God decided he could only really trust immediate family. So he sent his own son here to keep a close eye on the family business or the experiment and report back to his father. Who knows? But all in all, it begins to sound like a story that could be possible. Far more easy to understand and straightforward than the way that theologians have kind of twisted the interpretation of the Bible for religious purposes when you look at the translations of language. I'm not saying that this is the way that it is, but it is easy to see how it could be this way. And if it is this way, if it's about extraterrestrial colonization, then the Bible isn't just talking about how people of African descent should be slaves or women should be slaves. It is talking about an entire race of beings who were once created for the purposes of being slaves to extraterrestrials who were inhabiting the earth at the time. Changes everything. The majority of the world recognizes the Bible as being a symbolic reference that describes humanity's association with a single almighty God. Sometimes he's loving and kind, sometimes he's harsh and cruel. And we don't have to understand, we just have to have faith. Because faith is the proof that we use to demonstrate our virtue. But the literal translation of the Bible doesn't require us to have faith. It just requires us to recognize that we are one of many species of intelligent being who resided here on Earth, and for whatever reason, perhaps even because of the heroes who fought to make it that way, from the age of heroes, we ended up owning the earth and banishing our creators or slave masters so that they could no longer rule us. Personally, I really don't know, but it is an interesting concept. Don't you agree? And we have about as much proof of that being true as the various religions have of something else that they believe in being true. But I do believe very strongly that there will come a time when we will find out exactly what is true and what isn't. And it's becoming quite the possibility that that time is coming soon. I wonder what the truth will be and which version of events in the Bible will end up being the one that was right all along. Wouldn't it be something if one day there was proof that the fringe theories of today were actually about to become the mainstream theories of tomorrow? Wouldn't that be something? My name is Ellie. You can find me at Ellie Dreams Down Under on YouTube. Thanks to everyone who's watching on one of KGRA's broadcasting platforms. If you'd like to become a KGRA viewing member so that you can watch and chat with like-minded spiritualists, experiences, and weirdos like me, then remember to enter promo code Ellie to get 30% off your subscription. That's it for today. It's been a pleasure. Until next time.